The sound of her voice cut through the quiet afternoon like a siren. "You can't park there. Call the police," she shouted, pointing directly at my truck with a mix of panic and entitlement that could only belong to someone convinced they owned the world. I stood still, arms crossed, watching her flustered gestures, knowing full well that the next few minutes were about to escalate, but not in the way she expected. It all began with something ordinary. I had blocked my driveway for just a few minutes while unloading some equipment. Nothing unusual, nothing confrontational. Yet, for her, this small act was an immediate crisis. She stormed onto my property line as though she had been wronged in a life-altering way. The neighbors, curious as always, peeked through their blinds, sensing the brewing tension. But I stayed calm, a calm that would soon turn the tables entirely. Her phone was already out, fingers flying across the screen. The announcement that she was calling the police wasn't hesitant, it was loud, confident, and dripping with superiority. She believed that a few frantic words and the authority of law enforcement would guarantee her victory. She had no idea that she was about to encounter someone entirely prepared, someone who didn't respond to panic with panic, someone who commanded authority in ways she hadn't anticipated. Minutes later, the red and blue lights appeared in the distance, casting a flickering glow over the quiet street. She strutted forward with triumph in her step, expecting me to flinch, expecting compliance. I didn't move. My stance remained calm, composed, unshakable. Every second she fumed, I silently observed, noting the tiny cracks in her confidence beginning to form. When the officer arrived, her narrative rushed out of her mouth in a torrent: accusations, assumptions, exaggerations. "He's blocking my driveway. Suspicious behavior. Aggressive," she cried. Meanwhile, I simply stood there, letting her words fill the air, knowing the truth would speak louder than panic ever could. The officer glanced between us, slightly confused, and I handed over my identification calmly. The instant recognition passed in his eyes was subtle but enough to send a ripple through the situation. She noticed it immediately, and the first flicker of panic crossed her face. The confidence she had relied upon was cracking. In that moment, the dynamics shifted entirely. The woman who had thought she held all the power suddenly realized she was outmatched in every subtle, undeniable way. What happened next would completely shatter her assumptions and teach everyone watching a lesson in calm authority, patience, and the quiet weight of truth. The moment the officer recognized my credentials, the energy on the driveway shifted dramatically. His posture straightened, the casual caution he had brought with him vanished, and his eyes held a mixture of respect and surprise. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he allowed the moment to settle, letting the woman realize she had misjudged not only me but the entire situation. Her confident, self-assured posture began to crumble, replaced by subtle signs of panic: hands trembling, shoulders tightening, eyes darting between me and the officer. She tried to regain control, speaking rapidly, repeating her accusations: "He's blocking my driveway. It's dangerous. He's being aggressive." But her words were hollow, lacking conviction, and the officer's calm, measured demeanor only amplified the disparity. He asked pointed questions, prompting her to clarify her statements, and with each answer, the cracks in her story grew more obvious. It was almost painful to watch how quickly arrogance and entitlement could dissolve under scrutiny. Meanwhile, I remained still, exuding composure. Every inch of my body language communicated confidence and control. Years of experience commanding authority had taught me that silence can often speak louder than words. By not reacting defensively, I let the officer guide the interaction, allowing facts and truth to assert themselves naturally. Each pause, each deliberate movement, emphasized my calm dominance without the need for confrontation. She attempted another interjection, this time gesturing wildly toward my truck and repeating her demands. The officer held up a hand, signaling her to stop, and patiently continued his line of questioning. I answered clearly and concisely, providing precise information without embellishment or emotion. The contrast between my calm, factual responses and her flustered, scattered statements was glaring. It was a visual lesson in authority, patience, and control that everyone on the street could observe. By now, neighbors had started to gather quietly at a distance, peeking from windows or doorways. Their attention was drawn not to the conflict itself, but to the undeniable difference in composure between the two parties. It became clear that this wasn't just about a driveway, it was about perception, power, and the consequences of panic versus preparation. As her voice grew more frantic, her gestures more erratic, I realized that she had truly underestimated the situation. The moment of recognition when she fully grasped that she had walked into a scenario far beyond her expectations was coming. And when it arrived, it would leave her completely exposed. Her frantic attempts to regain control were almost comical, if the situation weren't so tense. She jabbed her finger toward my truck, then flicked her eyes toward the officer as if expecting immediate agreement. "You have to make him move," she insisted, her voice rising with desperation. But the officer, maintaining complete professionalism, simply shook his head slightly and asked her to explain calmly why she believed this was an issue. Every second that passed emphasized the growing gap between her assumptions and reality. She struggled, fumbling over her words, repeating the same points in slightly different ways, hoping something would land. But repetition without substance only magnifies weakness. Meanwhile, I stayed still, hands relaxed at my sides, tone measured when I finally spoke. "This is my property. The truck is parked legally, and no one is being blocked unfairly. Everything is within the rules. Simple. Clear. Truthful." My calm presence contrasted sharply with her rising panic. The officer's demeanor shifted subtly as he processed the information. He began to ask clarifying questions directly to her, each one revealing inconsistencies in her story. "Did you check the property lines? Are you aware who owns this driveway?" She faltered, realizing her assumptions had left her vulnerable. Her confident stance faltered as she searched for answers that didn't exist. Neighbors, now more visible from behind curtains and fences, were clearly watching the interaction unfold. Their reactions ranged from raised eyebrows to subtle nods, observing not the argument itself, but the dynamic of authority. It became obvious to everyone, one side was grounded in knowledge and calm, the other in panic and assumption. At this point, the panic on her face was unmistakable. Her lips trembled, eyes wide, hands shaking slightly. She had expected control, but now she faced the reality that she was outmatched. Every gesture, every shout, only reinforced her vulnerability. It was a dramatic, unspoken lesson in overconfidence, entitlement, and the consequences of misjudging someone who was prepared. Finally, the officer paused, looked directly at her, and said calmly, "I can see that everything here is in order. There's no reason for escalation." The weight of those words sank in, and the first flicker of true panic crossed her features. She realized that her assumptions had been completely wrong, and the reality of who I was, the base commander, was about to hit her like a wave. The moment she realized the officer was on my side, or at least objectively evaluating the facts, her panic deepened. Her confidence, which had carried her onto the driveway like a storm, began to crumble. Her eyes widened, her gestures became frantic, and her voice, which had been loud and commanding, faltered. Every accusation she had prepared so meticulously now sounded hollow. She had assumed that volume and urgency were enough to establish authority, but she was about to learn the hard truth: authority backed by preparation and composure cannot be intimidated. I remained calm, letting her unravel in real time. Years of experience had taught me the subtle power of presence. By simply standing tall, arms crossed, and responding with measured words only when necessary, I allowed the situation to reveal itself naturally. The officer, professional and neutral, facilitated the truth without needing to raise his voice or display unnecessary force. His questions were deliberate, forcing her to clarify points she hadn't fully considered. Each inconsistency in her statements became another crack in her collapsing facade. She tried again, pointing at the truck and repeating her claims about being blocked. "He can't do this. It's my right," she shouted, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her. Her words lacked the certainty she had started with, and the officer calmly reminded her to explain calmly and clearly. The simplicity of his instructions made her panic more pronounced. She realized that she could not control the narrative as she had hoped. Meanwhile, neighbors began to observe more intently, drawn by the visible tension and the dramatic reversal in control. Some whispered, exchanging glances of surprise, while others simply watched silently. The lesson for them was clear: real authority is not about shouting or making threats. It is about clarity, composure, and knowledge. This ordinary driveway had become a stage for an extraordinary display of power and patience. Her stammering continued, her attempts to justify herself failing repeatedly. Each sentence seemed to contradict the last, revealing the gaps in her assumptions. It was evident she had underestimated not only me but the entire scenario. The authority of truth and preparation outweighed her aggression entirely. Then came the moment of recognition, the instant she realized she was completely outmatched. Her eyes locked on mine, and for a split second, panic gave way to disbelief. She had assumed she was in control, but the reality was undeniable. She had walked into a situation where her assumptions were powerless against the quiet, steady authority I embodied. In that instant, everything shifted. The confrontation was no longer about a driveway, a truck, or a phone call. It was about control, perception, and the undeniable force of calm confidence. She understood, without question, that she had miscalculated completely. Her disbelief was palpable. She had marched onto my driveway full of confidence, fully convinced that calling the police would automatically grant her control. But now, as her eyes flicked between me and the officer, she realized she had completely misjudged the situation. Panic replaced arrogance, and every word she attempted to speak only highlighted her lack of preparation. It was almost like watching a carefully built house collapse under the weight of reality. I stayed calm, arms folded, my stance steady and unshakable. Years of leadership had taught me that authority doesn't need to be shouted, it is communicated through composure, clarity, and the subtle signals of confidence. The officer, still maintaining professional neutrality, asked her to clearly explain her reasoning. Her stammering answers revealed contradictions she hadn't anticipated. The more she tried to assert herself, the more her confidence crumbled. She pointed toward my truck, then toward the driveway, voice rising, but her gestures were jittery and uncoordinated. Her panicked energy made it clear she had assumed control without knowledge. The officer listened, nodding slightly, and then asked pointed questions that highlighted her flawed assumptions. He didn't need to raise his voice; his calm, precise questions alone were enough to put her on the defensive. Meanwhile, neighbors had begun to appear subtly, peeking from windows or doorways. Their reactions were telling: some whispered to each other, others nodded knowingly. They weren't watching for entertainment, they were witnessing a lesson in authority, perception, and the consequences of overconfidence. The contrast between my calm composure and her escalating panic was striking. It was a visual and emotional lesson in human behavior under pressure. She attempted to regain control by repeating her accusations, but the officer cut her off gently, explaining that misuse of emergency services could have legal consequences. Her shoulders tensed, and her eyes darted around, searching for an escape that didn't exist. She had walked into this encounter believing she could dominate the situation, but reality had a different plan. I spoke quietly, clearly, and without any trace of anger: "This is my property. Everything here is legal and orderly. There is no reason for escalation." The simplicity of my statement, paired with my steady presence, amplified her panic. The neighbors could see the stark difference: one person panicking, the other calm, controlled, and unshakable. By now, it was obvious, the confrontation had evolved from a simple driveway dispute into a masterclass in authority and composure. Her assumptions had been shattered, and the reality of who I was, the base commander, was fully sinking in. By now, the tension had reached its peak. She stood there, hands shaking slightly, mouth opening and closing as if searching for words that could somehow reverse the reality she was facing. Every accusation she had thrown at me now sounded weak, unconvincing, and desperate. She had assumed that volume and panic could establish dominance, but in the face of calm authority and clarity, her strategy was crumbling. I stayed silent, letting the officer facilitate the interaction. His measured questions and subtle nods reinforced the facts while highlighting the contradictions in her statements. Each response she gave revealed further gaps in her assumptions, and it became clear to everyone watching that she had underestimated the situation entirely. Her energy, once confident and commanding, was now frantic and scattered. Her gestures grew erratic, pointing at my truck, at the driveway, at me, each one betraying the panic building inside. The officer, maintaining complete professionalism, reminded her to calm down and clearly explain her concerns. This pause, simple yet deliberate, amplified the difference between her reactive panic and my composed authority. It became a visible lesson in how preparation and knowledge overpower impulsive aggression. Neighbors had begun to gather subtly around the scene, quietly observing from a distance. Some whispered to each other, exchanging nods of recognition, while others simply watched in awe. They were witnessing an unspoken demonstration of power and control, a real-time lesson on authority and human behavior. The contrast between my calm stance and her unraveling demeanor could not have been clearer. She attempted one final plea, her voice trembling with desperation. "You can't just..." But the officer held up a hand, gently yet firmly, and explained that there was no legal basis for her complaint. Her expression faltered completely. The realization hit her like a wave: she had walked into a situation under false assumptions and had no way to regain control. I finally spoke, my tone calm but firm. "This is my property. The truck is parked legally. There is no reason for you to escalate or make assumptions." Each word landed with quiet authority, further destabilizing her remaining confidence. The neighbors could see it, the undeniable power of composure, knowledge, and patience over panic and entitlement. Her retreating body language, slumped shoulders, hesitant steps, darting eyes made it evident that the lesson had been absorbed, at least temporarily. What had started as a minor driveway dispute had become an unforgettable encounter, a live demonstration of authority, perception, and the fragility of assumptions when confronted with reality. Even as she slowly stepped back, retreating toward the sidewalk, the intensity of the encounter lingered in the air. The street, once tense and charged with confrontation, began to settle into quiet, but the lesson of the day had left an indelible mark. What had started as a minor driveway dispute had evolved into a clear demonstration of the difference between assumption and reality, panic and composure. I stood near my truck, taking a slow, deliberate breath. Everything around me, the neatly parked vehicle, the orderly driveway, the suburban house, was unchanged, yet the symbolic weight of the moment was undeniable. This was more than property, it was a stage where authority had been demonstrated silently, yet powerfully. Calm, composed presence had achieved what yelling, assumptions, and panic could never accomplish. The officer had already begun returning to his cruiser, but his subtle nod of acknowledgement confirmed what I already knew: the situation had been handled flawlessly. Authority had been established without force or escalation, relying purely on preparation, knowledge, and calm demeanor. She had assumed she could control the scenario, but the truth had shifted the dynamic entirely. Observing her from the corner of my eye, I noted the subtle signs of lingering panic. Her face was pale, hands trembling slightly, and her gaze flicked repeatedly toward the truck and me. She was processing the reality she had walked into: a driveway dispute had turned into a humbling lesson in authority, perception, and control. Her assumptions had completely failed her. The neighbors, now slowly stepping out to survey the aftermath, whispered among themselves, nodding in subtle acknowledgement. Even from a distance, they could see the stark contrast between panic and composure, entitlement and knowledge, assumptions and authority. This wasn't just a lesson for her, it was visible proof to the entire street of the power of calm presence. I reflected briefly on her behavior, the frantic energy, the repeated assertions, the desperate need to control without information. It was a stark reminder of how fragile arrogance and entitlement can be when faced with preparation and clarity. She had learned quickly, though painfully, that shouting does not create authority, and assumptions do not replace knowledge. Finally, as the street returned to quiet, I felt the weight of the moment settle fully. This wasn't merely about a driveway or a truck, it was a test of human behavior, authority, and composure. And in that quiet suburban street, the truth had been demonstrated with crystal clarity: calm, prepared, and knowledgeable presence always prevails over panic, assumption, and entitlement. The street was quiet now, but the echoes of the confrontation lingered. Even from a distance, neighbors could feel the tension that had rippled through the neighborhood just moments ago. What had begun as a simple driveway dispute had turned into a lesson in authority, perception, and the subtle power of composure. The woman had walked in expecting control, only to realize she had misjudged the situation and me entirely. I stood near my truck, surveying the scene with a calm, deliberate gaze. My posture remained relaxed but confident, each movement purposeful. Every detail of the environment, the parked truck, the driveway, the tidy suburban house, reinforced my ownership and composure. But more importantly, it reinforced the lesson I had demonstrated: authority is not about volume or aggression, it is about calm presence, preparation, and clarity. The officer had returned to his vehicle but gave a subtle nod in my direction, a silent acknowledgement of the way the situation had been handled. His professionalism had allowed the truth to emerge naturally, highlighting the stark contrast between panic and control. The woman had assumed he would support her without question, but facts and composure had redirected the interaction entirely. Her panic, once hidden beneath overconfidence, was now unmistakable. I watched her reactions closely, shoulders tense, hands trembling slightly, lips parting as if to speak but quickly closing again. She had fully realized that her assumptions had been wrong. Every gesture she made conveyed disbelief, frustration, and helplessness. The neighbors could see it too, a woman unraveling under pressure while the person she had tried to challenge stood calm, composed, and unshakable. Her frantic attempts to justify herself were now futile. The officer, neutral but firm, reminded her again that her complaint lacked merit. She faltered completely, her voice shaking and words contradicting one another. The lesson was clear: assumptions without preparation collapse quickly when confronted by authority grounded in knowledge. Even as she slowly backed away, retreating toward the street, the impact of the confrontation was visible. The neighbors, who had been quietly observing, whispered and exchanged glances, absorbing the demonstration of real authority. This was not just a lesson for her, it was a lesson for everyone who had witnessed it: calm composure and preparation outweigh panic and entitlement every time. The driveway, the truck, and the suburban street had all become a stage for this unexpected, yet unforgettable, display of authority. And in that quiet aftermath, it was clear, the power of calm, measured presence had triumphed completely. Even as she disappeared further down the street, the tension from the encounter lingered like a heavy fog. The quiet neighborhood seemed almost surreal after the dramatic exchange. What had started as a simple misunderstanding over a parked truck had evolved into a vivid display of authority, perception, and the subtle art of control. Every detail, the trembling hands, the faltering voice, the incredulous looks from neighbors, spoke volumes about the power of calm composure in the face of panic. I walked slowly along the driveway, surveying the scene. The truck remained perfectly in place, the driveway neat and orderly, yet the symbolic significance of the moment was undeniable. This wasn't about property or a blocked driveway anymore, it was about control, authority, and the consequences of misjudging someone who is prepared. My presence had shifted the energy entirely, turning her panic into a public demonstration of what happens when assumptions collide with reality. The officer, now returning to his cruiser, offered a subtle nod of acknowledgement. His recognition of the situation confirmed what I already knew: the interaction had been handled flawlessly. Authority had been established without aggression, without escalation, and without the need to raise my voice. Facts and composure had spoken louder than panic or entitlement. She had expected control but had instead confronted calm, measured power. I glanced back toward where she had been, catching the fleeting expressions of neighbors observing from behind windows and across the street. Some whispered to each other, some shook their heads subtly, and all were absorbing the lesson without a word being spoken. Authority, real authority, is visible even to those who are not directly involved. It communicates itself through presence, confidence, and the unshakable command of facts. Her earlier bravado had completely vanished, replaced by visible discomfort and disbelief. Panic had taken over, showing the fragility of assumptions based on entitlement rather than knowledge. She had walked in expecting an easy confrontation, but now she was confronted with the stark reality: she had miscalculated entirely. Every shout, every gesture, every attempt to dominate had been futile. As I took one last survey of the driveway and the truck, it was clear that the lesson extended beyond her. This encounter had demonstrated a timeless truth: calm authority, preparation, and clarity will always prevail over panic, entitlement, and assumptions. The driveway dispute had become a microcosm of human behavior under pressure, a vivid reminder of how quickly arrogance can crumble in the face of composure and truth. The street had finally returned to its quiet, suburban rhythm, but the impact of the confrontation lingered in the air. What had started as a minor driveway dispute had become a powerful demonstration of authority and human behavior under pressure. She had walked in expecting dominance, armed with assumptions, entitlement, and panic disguised as confidence. She left confronting the reality that calm, prepared authority cannot be shaken by noise or fear. I stood near the truck, arms crossed, surveying the driveway and the surrounding property. Everything was in order, neat and undisturbed, yet the symbolic weight of the scene was unmistakable. The truck, the driveway, the suburban house, each element reinforced the story that had unfolded: control isn't about volume or aggression, it's about composure, preparation, and the quiet command of truth. The officer, now back in his cruiser, had given a subtle nod of acknowledgement. His professional calm had provided the framework for the truth to emerge. She had assumed he would automatically side with her, but facts and measured presence shifted the dynamic completely. She had expected validation and power, only to face undeniable control and authority. Her reactions during those final moments were telling. Shoulders slumped, hands trembling slightly, eyes darting repeatedly toward me and the truck, every gesture betrayed her disbelief and frustration. She had miscalculated entirely, and the lesson was impossible to ignore. Every whisper, every flustered attempt to speak, had failed to regain her lost composure. She had walked in with confidence, only to leave with the full weight of reality pressing down. Neighbors, who had gathered discreetly to observe the scene, now whispered among themselves. They weren't just watching a driveway dispute, they had witnessed a masterclass in authority, composure, and human behavior. The contrast between panic and calm had been crystal clear, leaving a lasting impression on everyone present. Finally, I spoke quietly to myself, reflecting on the encounter: authority is not proven through confrontation, shouting, or assumptions. It is demonstrated through preparation, composure, and clarity. The driveway, the truck, the suburban setting, these had all been the stage, but the true lesson was human. Panic collapses under calm, entitlement is fragile against knowledge, and assumptions are powerless against reality. As evening settled over the neighborhood, it was clear that the story had reached its conclusion. The lesson had been delivered, visible and undeniable. The woman had been humbled, the neighbors had learned silently, and the driveway stood as a quiet testament to the power of calm, measured authority. The confrontation was over, but the memory and the lesson would linger far longer than any raised voice or fleeting anger.